Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. We are excited to offer 2 starting levels of professional trainings designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is a psychoeducational training designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. The Level 2 NARM Therapist training is a comprehensive clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, as well as current mental health graduate students and clinical interns and trainees. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. And now for our interview. Elaine Miller-Karas holds the role of co-founder and executive director emeriti at the Trauma Resource Institute, pioneering groundbreaking initiatives such as the Community Resiliency Model and the Trauma Resiliency Model, both widely acknowledged interventions for addressing and preventing traumatic stress. She also established the Family Resiliency Project, equipping caregivers, educators, and community workers dealing with children. Elaine is the author of Building Resilience to Trauma, the Trauma and Community Resiliency Models, a work commended by the United Nations for its alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. She regularly contributes articles to Psychology Today on trauma-related subjects and hosts a weekly podcast titled Resiliency Within. Notably, Elaine spearheads the Ukraine Humanitarian Resiliency Program, and her expertise and dedication have garnered international recognition, showcased through her speaking engagements at prestigious institutions, including the Centers for Disease Control, the United Nations, and others. Please enjoy this conversation with Elaine Miller-Karas. All right, I am sitting here with Elaine Miller-Karas, and we are so happy to have you on the podcast. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you, Emily. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. And I wondered if we could start with this question that we often ask our guests, and that is, what would you like our listeners to come away with from our conversation today?
Well, I think if any of our listeners have experienced trauma in their lives, which many of us have, it's hard to go through life without having had some experiences with trauma, that if they are wondering whether or not that healing is possible, I'm here to say that absolutely there is. That there are so many different ways that you can learn to be in the present moment and to acknowledge, the suffering or the pain that you've had, but also to be able to remember. I often say this in the work that I do, what else is true? Mm-hmm. That even though you've experienced hardship, there's also, I imagine, strengths that you have, that sometimes if we shine a brighter light on those strengths and we not only think about them, but sense them, that amazing, sometimes even sacred, powerful healing is possible.
It's a beautiful way to open our conversation. Thank you, Elaine.
Yeah.
You and I connected just a little bit over email, and I told you before we press record, I've been getting familiar with your work, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Brad, our executive producer for the podcast, has such respect for the work you're doing. And so I wondered if you could start off by telling us about the work that you're doing and how you got into the field working with trauma.
Well, that's a big question. There's a lot of answers to that question. Well, first of all, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have always been very interested in helping with understanding what happens to us as we go through our journey as human beings, not only the struggles that we experience, but also the wonders that we experience. And how is it that some of us can get so entrenched with the suffering that we forget that there might be other ways of living? And I think that when in the late 90s, there was the amazing information that I think changed a lot of us. And that was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done in California. And I think that when Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti published that, it's certainly something that I already knew as a social worker, but to actually have the evidence that when difficult things happen to us when we're children, that it causes a change in our immune system. Not only in our immune system, it also causes a change in our brain so that it does affect our mood, and it can lead to greater depression and anxiety, and also even our attempts, right, to get out of the experience of the trauma that gets stuck in the body. And, I think one of the statistics that really hit me were that if you had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, that you were 4,200 times greater chance of becoming an IV drug abuser when you compare people who've had 0 adverse childhood experiences. And I thought, wow, think about all the things that we punish people for, that we sometimes, sadly look down and judge people for. If we were to understand that, and also then create programs and create the awareness and really the response of how to really bring this into a wider community so that we would know that, oh, that behavior is because of what happened to them, not because they're a bad person. And then if we can also go the next step and say, well, what can we do to help that? Mm-hmm. What can we do to bring healing to as many people as possible? So when I read that initial study in the late 90s, I was a teacher of family medicine. That's one of the wonderful things about being a social worker. You can have many derivations. Mm-hmm. I had a private practice, and I was teacher of family medicine. I'd worked in hospital social work. So I certainly was not foreign to the many sufferings that happen to people. But one of the things that, as a trauma therapist, and I was trained in many different modalities, I was really struck by the work of Peter Levine, which is how I met Brad. And I took the somatic experiencing training, which I still to this day will say it changed my life. It opened an awareness of how, and this was so important when I was working in family medicine, because I was teaching young doctors. They would see a patient, they go, well, I think it's all in her head. And I go, yeah, no, it's not all in her head, it's in her body. Mm-hmm. But I was able to give them the science. And that really comes from some of the work of, let's say, Bessel van der Kolk and others who were doing work in this area of really bringing the body into the equation of how we treat trauma. But I also noticed that when I took different trainings and even going to conferences, and Emily, you may notice this as being a therapist yourself, I thought, gosh, in this room, primarily white folks, primarily middle and upper middle class folks. And when I talk to people, who are they treating? Primarily middle and upper middle class folks who could afford to go to therapy. Right. And so some of the, and some people said, well, those kind of therapies are the boutique therapies because you have to have a lot of money to take them. And honestly, you do. And not everybody, and not every therapist, if you're a social worker working in the inner city, let's say San Bernardino, and you make X amount, that's different than working in Beverly Hills where you make $300 an hour, right? Mm-hmm. So as a social worker at heart, right, it's going, okay, how could we take this incredible burgeoning information and how could we create it in a way that was simpler? And some of the ideas that I had that were beyond some of the body-based stuff, solution-focused psychotherapy, for instance, by Insoo Kim Berg. And also what people don't know about me, but I'm going to share with you right now. Some people that take our Trauma Resiliency Model knows this. I was a Lamaze teacher. I was a doula.
I was too.
You see, being a doula and a Lamaze or a childbirth educator, when you are with women going through the most incredible physical experience of their life, it's a painful experience. Yet when you are nurtured, when you're guided, it doesn't take away all the pain, but it comforts you in knowing in between those contractions that there are people surrounding you in kind of a loving guidance. And so for me, part of learning about body-based therapies were really based in what I had learned as a Lamaze teacher, just simple breathing, right? Yeah. But there was more to it than that. But why I'm saying the Lamaze childbirth education, because I was a gentle guide. And if you were a doula as well, we're gentle guides.
That's right.
Right. Very gentle. And so when I was learning about some of these approaches, I am not a directive person. And I think with childbirth education, as the person has the contraction, then you decide, well, I wonder if it would be helpful if we change position. Mm-hmm. I wonder if it would be helpful if you walked. I'm wondering right now, sometimes if you notice your breath, that could be helpful for you right now. But notice it's not saying, take a breath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, breathe.
Right? Right. And sadly, I have so many therapists I've met around the world. Some therapies are very directive and some are not. And I have really chosen to go the non-directive invitational approach that's kind of based in my personality, but also was based in my foundations, really, of Lamaze childbirth education, which, by the way, I was before I became a therapist, before I became a social worker. And that's part of the answer to your question. Mm-hmm. Because in my first 2 classes as childbirth educator, 2 of the families lost their babies. And, tragically through things that one was born with a terrible heart defect, another one was born too early. And I knew that losing a child and losing a baby would be horrible, but I think that these two families gave me a vista into their lives that touched me deeply. So that was the first nonprofit that I was involved with starting, which was called Helping After Neonatal Death. And was an acronym, right? But I think that if I hadn't learned about all those families and the sweet lives of those babies that were cut short, I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now. Because when I started the support group, and I would literally take parents with me and knock on doors of hospitals and say, you need to do better. Parents, when they lose a baby, you need to not necessarily put them in the postpartum floor with another mother who's just had a living baby, and all the different injuries that they would do out of not because they were intentionally being mean. This was in the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. They were doing it because they didn't know better. So we created a movement then. And then I met some wonderful social workers in hospitals and said, Elaine, you would be a great social worker. And I thought, I think I'd like this too. So I went back to school and I became a social worker with the intention of being involved in perinatal care. Mm-hmm. So that was going to be what I was going to do. I'm going to be a perinatal social worker. I was really fortunate that I did my graduate internship at Stanford at the Mid-Coastal Perinatal Outreach Program, which I had amazing opportunities of learning and clinical work as well as policy. Us there, Charlene Kanger, an amazing nurse who really helped me to learn a lot about how do you negotiate, not only to me as a social worker, trauma therapist, but helping individuals, but also changing systems. Mm-hmm. So I think that was kind of always in my blood. And so I became a social worker, and then we moved to Southern California. I became a teacher of family medicine, and I was teaching young residents. And, if I went in there as a social worker and did just fluffy stuff, they would not have listened to me. But I said, there's a science I want to tell you about the autonomic nervous system and what happens when there's hyper and hypoarousal. And some of the growing body of evidence is showing that there's immune changes that happen when that HPA axis, that stress response, gets out of whack. So what I did is I started talking their language. And guess what happened? They really listened to me. Yeah. In the beginning, they're going, oh, we got to go talk to the social workers. I want to talk about real medicine. I go, well, guess what? I'm going to talk to you about real medicine. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the interns I called her a baby intern many years ago. She's been on my board of directors since we started because she saw the power. When I started creating the Community Resiliency Model, especially, which we called it something different in the beginning, but she saw me go in with her and in a very short period of time, help people regulate their nervous system and get back into what we call the zone of well-being or the resilient zone. Mm-hmm. And I started creating simple language that I wanted it to be understandable, not just by therapists, but by people that didn't necessarily have the advantage of all the education that you and I have had advantages to, because I was working with underserved populations. Mm-hmm. Well, how I met Brad was I was kind of in the process of designing this new model. And the first derivation, I did it with a woman named Jeannie Everett. It was called Trauma First Aid. And we were fortunate enough to go to New Orleans to kind of pilot. Is this working? Can we take this short-term little model that we've created? And Jeannie and I were doing it. Brad came and helped along with many other people. Many of them were from the SC community. But Jeannie and I were going, oh my gosh, this really works. And we can teach things really simply. And we can teach it after this mass scale disaster.
And this was after Hurricane Katrina, right?
Katrina and Rita, but that was where I started the nonprofit. That was I was starting to create this between 2001 and 2005. Those kinds of experiments with my residents, right? Teaching them about the nervous system, but most importantly, many of the patients that came in, they were in a hypo or a hyper aroused state. Many of them were not in their zone of well-being, but they were living in where there's gang violence and drive-by shootings. And that the service in 2005, when the start of the Iraq War, is that many times people in underserved communities are heavily recruited. So many of the families had children that were in the service. Oh. And that of itself, for many of the families, it was so traumatic. They were losing their children. Children were coming home wounded. And many of them had come from other places where there had been maybe the civil war in El Salvador. You see, the trajectory has always been global. And part of that came from my upbringing. So my grandmother and mother immigrated to the United States from El Salvador. Mm. So I grew up in a very bicultural family with really community orientation. And also knowing that, some of my family members may needed therapy, but they were not therapeutically or psychologically oriented. I think that changed the way I thought about what would be something my mother would have gone to. And that came with the Community Resiliency Model, right? Mm. Because if the priest would have told my mom There's a class after Mass where you can learn skills of well-being that will help you and your family. She'd be the first one to sign up. But if she's, oh, we think you've had trauma, you need to go to a trauma therapist. So we know this therapist that, is around the block where you live, blah, blah, blah. She wouldn't have gone to, because you don't share things outside the family, right? So I wanted you to know that trajectory, because those were there were so many influences that were happening at the same time that were coming together for me to really be what has come now to be. I'm the key developer of these models because of these kind of lived experiences I've had. So I have to say, when we started the nonprofit in 2006, and now it's, 2023? I can't believe it's been so long. But I would never have imagined, honestly, Emily, that I would have lunch with the Dalai Lama. I mean, how could that ever be? But what happened was, when we created this approach that was so incredibly scalable, so reachable to so many people, because we not only train therapists, we train what I call natural leaders of communities. Because the Central Plateau of Haiti, which I've been to after their earthquake of 2010, how many trauma therapists, Emily, do you think were in Hench, which is outside of Port-au-Prince, after that earthquake? You want to take a guess? There was one.
Oh, one more than I thought.
She was a psychologist. She had a PhD. She'd been trained in the Dominican Republic. But how many thousands of people were impacted by that trauma? There were many. So we did one of our first projects there, with really learning from the Haitians, who I dearly admire and respect, because they've suffered so much. And then I could see how, when they learned about their nervous system, really simple education, and learn ways to stabilize their nervous system, that it changed them. And it changed people that some of them couldn't read or write. But, even if you can't read or write, you live with your nervous system every day, and you can learn to track and read your nervous system. And so those were such great beginnings for me of really realizing the potential. And, now our little model has been brought to like 75 plus countries. It hasn't all been by me, but because we train natural leaders to be community resiliency model teachers, one teacher can influence so many people. We have in fact, I did an introduction to a CRIM teacher training that's going on right now. I like to pop in because I can't go to all of them now because there's too many of them. But there's one of the people who's one of our senior faculty. Her name is Sarah Cook. Sarah learned the model in 2016, and she's already working in parts of Africa and Europe with restorative justice work, peacemaking work. Well, then she started integrating the CRIM skills, and she's now brought the CRIM skills. She's keeping track. I said, you have to keep track to how many countries you go to. 50 countries she's brought the CRIM skills to. That's one person, right?
Now, can you share with us more about what the CRIM skills are? Because I know so this is the somatic nervous system work that you're doing.
So the Community Resiliency Model, we'll call it CRIM because it's just easy to say it. So basically, it's 6 wellness skills. It can be shared across the lifespan. It's been shared across cultures. It can be shared with people of different abilities, whether you can read or write, whether you're challenged by not being able to walk, whether you're in a wheelchair, whether you're even a quadriplegic, a person with quadriplegia can learn the skills. And the skills, the core of the skills, and this is what I've learned about all the somatic body-based models that are important to our model, and that is interoceptive awareness. What is interoception? Interoception is the human ability to pay attention to sensations and then take action. So, for example, in California today, I have a sweater on because it's cold outside. It's not cold very often here. So often if I go outside and my nervous system, my body reads the temperature, if it's warm, I wouldn't be having this heavy sweater on. But if I go outside and my temperature, my sensation is cool, then of course I'm going to put on the jacket. You see how the action happens. Well, what interoception, the ability to pay attention to our sensations, what neuroscientists are finding all over the world that are studying this is that those of us who can learn how to read our nervous system and then take different actions, perhaps, that we not only have better impulse control, but we have better affect regulation, which just means we control our feelings better. Those are simple things, right? We all have that ability. And so when we read the nervous system, that is a central part of the model, is helping people understand the language of the sensory language. So I even have the slide that I created that has 3 doorways. One doorway is thinking, one is feeling, and the other is sensing. And we, as human beings, we have all 3 portals available to us. but we haven't paid much attention to this amazing portal that we have that is of the sensory portal. And when we start to pay attention to that, it literally is one of the answers to the question you asked me in the beginning.
Yeah.
And that is when we learn to tell the difference. And this is what I found to be the core of the CRIM skills. When you learn to tell the difference between sensations of distress and well-being, then you have a choice of what to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that if you're suffering and you're feeling the suffering, let's say in your limbs, and you start thinking about, oh, what helps me get through hard times? Oh, my granddaughter. Oh, she's so lovely and she has a sweet smile. And I love, being in the pool with her. All of a sudden I feel my muscles relax and I'm going, oh, I can really bring my attention to that. And I often use the metaphor of a garden when I'm explaining the skills. And when I'm explaining this sensory awareness, this interoceptive awareness of reading the nervous system, is that if you have a garden and you plant vegetables and you plant flowers, there's always weeds in gardens all over the world, but only decided to water the weeds in your garden, that what would happen?
The weeds are
would take over, right? But if you decide to say, okay, the weeds could still be there, and maybe that's remembering our experiences and our trauma, but not having to say that's the focus of our entire attention. But I start putting water on these vegetables and fruits and flowers. And then there's the cultivation of a garden. There's the cultivation of the well-being that lives inside of me. So we do that. Second skill, which is developing our lived resources, our lived experiences of well-being. And that can be me remembering my granddaughter, or the last time I was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, that I dearly love, and going to see into the countryside, or being with a dear friend. I've asked the question to many people, what or who uplifts you? I often start our trainings that way. I would say when I ask that question all over the world, the answers are family, friends, faith, oftentimes fur babies, the 4 Fs. Kind of 4 Fs.
For family.
Yes, but it's also such a reminder for me of our common humanity, that the things that are important to you in Arizona, to me in California, we just did a training for the United Nations in Angola. The same answers to the same questions are the same, really worldwide. Sometimes it's scattered with a few other things like, oh, I like to fish. I like to do certain other things, right? So developing your resources. But if you were to ask me, Emily, Elaine, when you think about your granddaughter and all the different things you like to do with her, what happens on the inside? Well, I just feel a great sense of warmth in my chest. I feel my muscles relax. So it's as simple as that. And just bringing that simple skill, developing with that interoceptive awareness of what happens inside. It stabilizes the nervous system. It brings you into that zone of well-being. Then the third skill we have is, which is really true of many different models of that you see in psychology, and that is grounding. But we teach it third for a purpose. When I first started this work many years ago, I was working with a lot of veterans, and I found that when we started with grounding, when they were paying attention to themselves in the present moment with their body, they sometimes would brace because they would go into a traumatic flashback. But I found that when you started with a resource that's already embedded in your nervous system as a memory, and then you sense it, then you could go to a grounding exercise as being in the present moment, because that's the importance of grounding, is that you're not in the past or you're not looking at the future. You're right there in the present moment, which is a problem for those of us who've had trauma, because the past invades the present moment. So those are I call those the basic 3 skills. But the other thing I found as I went around the world is that there were often gestures that people made when they were sensing their well-being. Now they're different and there can be unique, but oftentimes I think probably the most common one I've seen is when people talk about somebody or something dear to them, they'll put their hand to their heart. So in the beginning, you say, oh, well, I do that a lot. But if we don't have conscious awareness of it, it's like we haven't saved that moment of well-being to like our nervous system. So when I see someone do that, I said, oh, I noticed as you were telling me about your granddaughter that you put your hand to your heart. Did you notice that? Oh, yes, that's right. I can feel her right here. And you often see then a parasympathetic breath, and they come back into that zone of well-being. So we actually have an intentional practice of identifying your self-soothing gestures that are not self-harming. And you keep them with you all the time, right? I have this one where I rub my one thumb on top of the other. So if I'm getting nervous, I often do that and I can feel my nervous system. It's so practiced that I come back in a zone of well-being. And then the next skill has to do, they're called help now to reset now. And these are strategies to use if you're way out of your zone of well-being. We call it the high zone or the low zone. And they're very simple. It could be like drinking a glass of water. It could be, would you like to go for a little walk with me, Emily, right now? That's helpful for both of us. And, when we walk, maybe we can just pay attention to how our feet are coming into the ground. Or I wonder if we name the colors of the room. If we named all the colors in our room, I wonder what would happen. So there's like 10 strategies. There could have been 200, but we've kind of made these 10 strategies in a little menu. And there's a school in Dharamsala, India, for example, that they have taken these 10 strategies and they have murals in their school. And the children know that if they're out of their zone, they can go do one of these strategies. I just, that gives me such joy to my heart to think about children learning these skills. Because of Sea Learning and other associations we've had, we're in many schools all over the world now. So that's the help now strategy. And the final one is very simple. And it's kind of the recapping. We call it shift and stay. So shift from sensations of distress to sensations of well-being and stay with the sensations of well-being. So keep watering that well-being. And what happens then is that expands your ability with practice to really, in a moment's notice, to, there's that distress. I'll shift. And how do you shift there? It could be just noticing a sensation of well-being, but you may need one of the skills to get there. So you can shift by identifying one of your resources. You can shift by grounding. You could shift by a self-soothing gesture or to one of the help now strategies. And then all of them would be, and then notice what happens on the inside. So those are the 6 skills. They're very simple. Even a little kid can learn them. That's what makes it exciting when I hear what they do in schools, right?
Yeah.
With children. I love my most favorite story of a child. And I have to tell you this story because this is
Please.
Yes, I was in New Delhi in India for the launch of the Sea Learning program. We had all these really thousands of people around the world were there for the launch of His Holiness's idea that I felt so honored to be part of writing chapter 2. And that's the Community Resiliency Model skills.
Yes.
And so we had the honor of interviewing the children on the stage. And when I interviewed the children with a friend of mine, her name is Lindy Sevendemdemi, we asked the children the questions, well, what did you like best about Sea Learning? And could you share something that really helped you? And what would you change about it? So one of the little boys, he was about 9 years old and very, very articulate, very well dressed. I didn't know at that time. I found out later that all the children that were interviewed were from a school in Dharamsala where His Holiness lives. And we're at the Tonglen school. And the Tonglen school was started by one of the monks. And it was for the children who grew up in the slums in Dharamsala. So this little boy said, sometimes I get very sad. I'm just going to simplify what he said. He goes, but I read my nervous system and I feel the heaviness in my arms. The sadness is so heavy. Teachers know, because we have the murals at the school, that I can go use one of the help now strategies. And the one that helps me the most is pushing against the wall. He goes, and I push and I push and I push and I push against the wall. Slowly feel the sadness start to leave, coming down my arms through my hands and then leave me. Enough. And I love that he said that.
Yeah.
The sadness leaves me enough. So then I can go back in and pay attention and study again. So he can come to a zone of well-being where he can then be his best self in mind, body, and spirit. And I learned about the little boy later that one of his parents had died and the other one was a drug addict and his 2 brothers still lived in the slum and he missed them. That's where his sadness came from. And Emily, isn't that organic that he would say the sadness left enough?
Yeah.
How would the sadness completely go away? So experiences like that with the skills and that little boy, and when I think of him and I see his little face, knowing that he's going to have that skill for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've learned with these community resiliency model skills, that once you learn them, and if you like them, you don't forget them. We even have an app called iChill.
Yeah.
iChill, and we have it in English, Spanish, and Ukrainian right now. We've had a big project in Ukraine, which we've done through Zoom. It's been an amazing project, one of the most amazing ones of my life. But we've also been responding to the recent horrible tragedy. This is day 53 since the terrorist attack that happened. We have amazing Crim teachers in Palestine, and we also have Crim teachers in Israel. We are not a political organization. The Trauma Resource Institute, we are a humanitarian one. So we bring our healing methods to all people. and we stay out of the politics of that because there's plenty of politics for other people to talk about.
Sure.
But we have met with our associates in these different countries. We were so grateful. We just got a number of donations that's going to allow us to update our iChill app platform. So we're going to be adding Hebrew and Arabic and also Japanese and Portuguese. Our hope is one day we'll have many, many languages on the iChill app, because then you have skills literally in the palm of your hand at all times.
So you talked about the different parts of is it the model? Is that how you would talk about it?
Well, so, we have the skills and then we have key concepts of the model. So let me just also say that we have the Community Resiliency Model and we have the Trauma Resiliency Model. The Trauma Resiliency Model is directed towards mental health professionals. And so that not only teaches the Community Resiliency Model skills, but it also has further reprocessing skills that come from, Pat Ogden's work, Peter Levine's work, and some of my own thoughts about how we restore balance in the nervous system. And so those are what we call the trauma reprocessing skills of the trauma resiliency model. But what we've also learned is, so we have a growing body of evidence for the community resiliency model. It's been studied now with nurses, with first responders, with people in drug treatment, with people in other countries that are dealing with Ebola virus. There's been people that have been researching the model in Sierra Leone. And what's pretty amazing about the model is, I'm saying it's pretty amazing to me, actually, when the research comes out, because I've known this anecdotally, right?
Sure.
But when they actually do randomized controlled trials and they say, oh, do you realize that this is such a small dosage and it has a reduction in depression, anxiety, traumatic stress symptoms, and improvements in well-being, including a reduction in hostility indicators. And dosage is small, Emily. So that's the other part about it. And it's also being taught by natural leaders. And that means that increases the probability of more people getting the skills, and especially in under-resourced areas of the world, but also in the United States. You're out there in Arizona, there's rural areas of Arizona where there's very limited resources.
Absolutely.
Especially if you look at some of the, let's say, some of the indigenous individuals. In fact, we've trained 10 people from the Dene, also known as the Navajo, that they have their own teachers of the community resiliency model, which they've translated into the Dene language, which is also called Navajo. And isn't that amazing, right? That they can actually take that and scale it. But I guess is what I'm saying is, when I first started with the community resiliency model, I realized as I was traveling through and talking to people that it does reprocess trauma, but body sensory trauma. Because when a person learns to read their nervous system and tell that difference between sensations of distress and well-being, and their amygdala is firing because of their past experience with a traumatic event, that now they're, for whatever reason, being reminded about it in present moment because of implicit memory and how that whole thing works. And when we say, oh, you can do something else, so that when that traumatic memory gets sparked, then you don't have to continue down the distress of that reminds you of when you were 10 years old and were assaulted by someone, right? So then, we don't have the evidence to actually look in the brain and see this, but my hunch is that we're dampening that reactivity of the amygdala. We're changing the brain. And it's because you can still get sparked, but the potency of that spark is not the same. Now, I'm intentionally not saying trigger because I'm trying to de-weaponize my language. And I'm so, we usually use trigger to say this. I'm just out loud because I think that is an important, when I'm learning about semantics about that. So I call it, when those things get sparked or cued of that experience that we've had in our life, which is one of the reasons, again, going back to your first question. I remember a person telling me that when they leave their home, it's like there's landmines everywhere. Of those memories of past traumatic experiences. And what if you learned to diffuse those landmines? And see, I think through the sensory awareness, you can do that. Because even though we can say cognitively, that happened years ago, the smell of cologne should no longer bother me. Well, your amygdala's gone, well, that might work for your thinking brain, but it doesn't work for me. Because when I smell that smell, I'm thinking you're in danger. And so I'm going to trigger that stress response. Your heart's going to beat fast. And I'm telling you, get the heck out of Dodge. Right. So anyway, so I've learned now that really all the skills help to reprocess the trauma in different ways. And that's what's so, I think, as a trauma therapist, I don't want any of the trauma therapists to think, well, are you trying to get rid of my profession, Elaine? Of course not. Because the other thing that happens is we know that there's not enough mental health professionals to deal with all the trauma in the world. But when I equip a natural leader with the CRIM skills and also equip them to know they can do triage. If they see someone, they go, well, I'm helping them. They're getting, I can see they keep coming back to my community group, but they're having a really difficult time. I said, well, we might want to think about, these are the referrals you might want to work to the community health center, mental health center, where there's licensed professional therapists and perhaps a psychiatrist that can help. Maybe this person needs to be on medication that can also help them, because you can be on medication and learn these skills, right? There's not anyone who can learn the skills. So I think it also can increase the accessibility for some folks who may be a little bit more reluctant to seek mental health counseling. When you have a natural leader as that first kind of line of defense, helping them understand that we're talking about how the human nervous system works all over the world when we've had trauma and how it heals.
Yeah. This is so beautiful. There's so many pieces of this that I'm tracking, and I wish we had hours to keep talking. But a few things are jumping out at me. Number one, these skills that you're teaching. I mean, how phenomenal that you're getting this into spaces where children are being taught. So there's this prevention element of like hoping to equip children with this so that when they're faced with these challenges, that they're able to move through in a smoother way. But then there's also this piece that I'm hearing, you're responding to disasters, you're responding to shock trauma, and that this kind of encompasses various ways of meeting people wherever they are and giving them the tools and the skills to navigate. And so that's so beautiful. You have this app, you have your book.
Oh my gosh, I just happen to have it sitting here. The other thing, it's the second edition. I just published the second edition, and I have many co-authors of the book as well, because I've asked different people who have different expertises that we co-authored some of the chapters. And I just heard from my publisher that they're going to be doing an audio version too, which I'm very excited about.
Fantastic.
It's going to be also in Ukrainian. The Ukrainians have really embraced this model, and I'm very happy about that.
Wonderful. And I know just from scanning things, it looks like you have a chapter on neuroscience, and there's a section on addiction, and you have research stuff in there, and working with the military and attachment theory. So much richness there in that book. So I hope folks will check that out.
Yes, I hope so.
And then you also have a radio show, which I know can be accessed on podcast platforms. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I have on Voice America, I have a weekly show called Resiliency Within, and I interview world leaders, world people who are doing amazing work in the area of trauma and well-being and resiliency. I also occasionally have some authors, because I just really am curious about the book that they've written. I just had Dr. Alan Sussman, who wrote a book about saving the art of medicine, which I, of course, as a former teacher of family medicine, I'm very dedicated to, and it's a lovely book. But I get to interview these wonderful people from around the world. My broadcast is live, but also then gets turned into a podcast, and it's available on all the different mediums. If you put my name in there and Resiliency Within, you'll see my plethora of different, I've done the show now for almost 3 years, and I very rarely have an encore show. So it's a good library of learning about the different things I do in the world.
That's so fantastic. Well, I'm just so excited for folks to hear more from you, and they can access all of these ways. They can get in touch with the work that you're doing. But I just am so grateful that you have made the time to be with us. And maybe in the future, we'll have you back so you can share with us more about how your work is on the ground.
Been a very sacred journey for me. And people can learn also more about us by going to traumaresourceinstitute.com. And we have a lot of free offerings of things. We just had also an association with Medscape, where there's an 1.5-hour presentation of an introduction to CRIM that's completely free. If you go to Medscape and put in Community Resiliency Model, it will come up.
Fantastic.
So we're trying to, reach to as many people as we can, because I just want to say, remember that healing's possible. And the body has a wisdom that when we learn how to read it, that it can really help us to be in the present moment and be able to go to school, go to church, synagogue, temple, go to the grocery store, the market, take care of our families, coming from the best part of ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Elaine.
No, thank you, Emily.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma? If so, we invite you to consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model in support of trauma-informed care. We are excited to offer psychoeducational and clinical trainings for a variety of mental health professionals. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.